So we've spent most of the conference so far talking about digital technologies and information technology in government, and how IT can transform government. And we've also heard a lot in that about how one of the major barriers to all of the good things that IT can do is people and actual civil servants. And had a little bit of civil servant bashing and a little bit of potentially pointing out that people are a challenge and are the key issue actually for getting the most out of technology. So, this session is trying to focus directly in on that question of people, not necessarily in connection with technology, but people in government in general, because there have been lots of waves of transformation and reform that people try and affect in government to improve performance, of which digital is perhaps the latest. And I think probably for all of those efforts of transformation, you would hear the same story, that actually the biggest problem here was the people, and we just couldn't get people on board, and they were the biggest stumbling block. So this session is to think about that question of people, but not just people as problems that need to be fixed, but people in government as fixers of problems, and the people who themselves are often the source of most of the original ideas in order to try and fix these problems. We have a great panel to do this with us. So on my far left, we have Beth Blauer, who's, as you've just heard, the executive director of the Center for Government Excellence at Johns Hopkins University. Immediately to my left, we have Rupert McNeil, who's the Chief People Officer of the UK Civil Service. To my right, Ms. Charlene Chang, who is the Senior Director of the Public Service Division in the Prime Minister's Office in Singapore. And on my far right, Dustin Brown, who is the Deputy Assistant Secretary. Is that right?
Director.
Deputy Assistant Director.
For management.
For management. Apologies.
No.
So I've asked each of our panelists to start by just speaking for a few minutes on their kind of initial thoughts about this question of people-centered approaches to thinking about improving government. And I'd like to ask Beth to start us off.
Oh, okay. So pretend like you didn't hear me talk at all in the last session, because I'm going to actually start from a really interesting place. And that place is like what I think is the most promising place in government, which is in the middle. So we talked a little bit about how the middle can be your biggest barrier, but I actually think that it is the middle of government where we have the most opportunity to do reform and to actually leave a lasting lasting change. And the reason why I think the middle is the place is because it is the middle that has demonstrated their commitment to the work. But what has happened, I think, over the last several decades is a divestment in the skills of those people that have committed to a career in government. And so we have new skills that come in typically with the front line, and we oftentimes will even get new skills that come in with leadership because of the ability to attain new skills as you do engage in more higher education. But for those folks that have entered government and started like I did as a probation officer or on the front lines of government and have moved their way up through government, there is a divestment that happens. And there used to be a time where you would actually get trained in government so that you could nourish your skills. So there were incentives. Your regular performance review was then tied to additional training, and training wasn't because you've done something wrong and you have to go to training. It was because they wanted your skills to improve so that you could move up or you could go to the next level in the government that you were going in. When the economic crisis started to emerge, and in government it started even before 2008, we were making big cuts in the late 90s and early 2000s, and the very first programs that were evaporated in government were those that created incentives for people to improve their skills. So all of that training sort of got taken off the table, and performance reviews that were tied to financial incentives were basically eradicated in most governments. And all of a sudden, there were no more incentives for building out your skills. And so what has happened is that we've got now an evolving government, and we have the same basic skills because people have stayed in their careers from about 20 years ago. And it's very difficult for someone that was raised in an era before they started using email in a prolific or collaborative way, to now start thinking about how to integrate SaaS-based software into a process that will allow them to make decisions differently, or even to trust a risk assessment that hasn't been that is being tested in a particular area, or to think about new or emerging technologies. And so I really honestly believe that the opportunity that we have now is to start to re-nourish the skills of the middle of government and start leading government from the middle out, so that we can create a much faster paced adoption of new ideas, so that we can spread best practices, and so that those things that do work will actually be sustained when there is political leadership turnover or turmoil. And so when we think about people and the opportunity that is presented, I do think very, very passionately that we focus on that middle sector, and we start to nourish those skills, that we start to really prioritize investment and I think the gamble that I'm making is that if we do that effectively, then we're going to see a much different face of government as we evolve in sort of this new era of governance.
Great. Thanks very much, Beth. I'd like to continue by handing over to Dustin over at this end.
Sure. Great to be here. First time here at Oxford with Blavatnik School, and looking forward to being here for the next couple of days. In kind of reflecting on this, I mean, first of all, one of the things I think that's maybe noteworthy about my position is actually I'm responsible for the mission performance management framework of the U.S. federal government that defines outcomes, goals, review processes, and transparency kind of on how we're doing. I also am responsible for coordinating across federal agencies when no single agency can achieve kind of the goal. So I think that's a really helpful context for thinking about the people issue, which I also have kind of responsibilities over within my kind of portfolio at OMB. And that connection between kind of the workforce and the mission outcomes, I think, often isn't as clearly kind of connected in leaders' minds and in kind of even middle management minds. So we really try to emphasize that connection from the starting point. So I just want to divide up quick remarks in maybe three categories. One is around the people, second is around kind of just the processes we have, and then third, I'd love to touch on the technology and data front, because I do think there is a lot of potential there to use some of that to make changes to the first two kind of buckets. Just a few data points on kind of the characteristics of the federal workforce in the U.S. We got about 2 million civil servants across the federal government, 85% of which are outside D.C. Not many people in the country would recognize that fact, that 85% of the workforce is outside D.C. Most people think it's all located within the Beltway. We also have about 1.2 million in the military. Another 700,000 work for the Postal Service. And probably most importantly, we have about 3 to 4 times as many contractors supporting federal employees as we have federal employees. So that is something that I think is maybe a little bit atypical compared to other countries. We also have about 7,000 career SES, and I think even reflecting on Beth's comment, many of those SES see themselves as middle managers, even though they're the senior most career officials in their jobs, because in the U.S. system, we have about 3,000 to 4,000 political appointees who occupy the top 4 levels of government, and on average serve for about 2 years. And so there's a constant changeover in the top levels of each of the federal agencies, which again, I think just presents some kind of unique features about the system that we're working in. Probably one of the more noteworthy things is the changes that are going to happen over the next 5 or 10 years in the U.S. Workforce. We currently have only about 7% of our workforce that's under the age of 30. That's compared to 23% in the private sector. We're going to see the percent of federal employees eligible to retire double from 15% to 30% over the next 5 years. And just an even more scary data point, the percent of our IT workforce that's under 30 is actually 3%. So when you talk about the kind of challenges, and let's also talk about opportunities, right? To kind of re-energize who we're attracting, I think we really have a series of big challenges, but also some opportunities to bring some new civil servants in with fresh ideas. Moving kind of to the process piece, I'm a big believer that like routines drive culture. And I think when we take a look at the types of routines we have in our space, one of the observations I think most people will come to is it's very compliance-oriented. I think a fundamental challenge we have with our workforce is we don't generally trust them. We don't trust them to make a hiring decision. We don't trust them to make a procurement. And we put a tremendous amount of laws, regulations, policy guidance, I know I write some of them at OMB, that make it very difficult to kind of execute even the simplest of hiring actions, removing poor performers, developing our professionals. So I think that is something that we need to take a real hard look at within the government. In particular, in the HR space, we are still not automated. I think the private sector, 10, 20 years ago, largely automated most of the HR kind of transactional work, which allowed our HR professionals to take on a more strategic role. In the U.S. federal government context, we are still largely paper-based. So when a federal employee transfers from one federal agency to another, which happens, by the way, about 100,000 times a year, that is a paper document that gets transferred from one agency to another. So we have a goal to automate that within the next 2 years. And just some basic things like that, I think, could really help drive kind of greater efficiencies and kind of free up our HR workforce in particular to be more strategic. Final thing I'll touch on is around technology and data. I think this is the real kind of bright spot. As we try to close the gap between people's experiences with the private sector, online experiences, and then what they see from government, that is driving a demand for new technology. And I think, more importantly, that's going to drive a demand for a new type of hire coming in. Probably most notable that we've had in terms of successes here is standing up a U.S. digital services group, which we took full advantage of the failure of the healthcare.gov launch, as some of you may know. Never waste a good crisis. And we use that to be able to recruit in about 200 people is where the team stands right now from Silicon Valley. And they are driving major improvements. And the important thing is it's not just in the technology space. It's actually really basic process improvement, getting different organizations, talking to the product managers are exactly the type of role that many of these individuals are thinking about design from the customer standpoint, not from what the law says or what the requirements are from a top-down standpoint. So they are really, I think, a bright spot and a multiplier force for change. And I think they've gotten their hiring process down, for instance, to 6 weeks, whereas our average is about 100 days across other agencies, because they make it a priority for everybody in the organization to spend time on recruitment and hiring. That is not the norm, but I do think there are some bright spots like this that are driving big change within our government that are now starting to catch on and have a force multiplier effect. So let me just kind of pause there and welcome any kind of questions going forward.
Great. Thank you, Dustin. So we should probably let some non-Americans speak as well. Charlene.
Thank you, Martin. And first off, let me express my appreciation to the Blavatnik School for having me here. Very appreciative of the opportunity to share with you some of the experience that we've had in Singapore for public sector transformation. And I think equally valuably is also for us to, for me at least, to learn about your experiences as you grapple with this big challenge of transformation that all of us are staring in the face across the world. I think when I first got the theme for our panel session, I thought, wow, it's going to be a really tall order to kind of summarize thoughts about this really important aspect of transformation in 5 or 7 minutes. But of course, I'll do my level best. I thought how I wanted to look at it was in terms of making transformation real to people, down to the last person on the line, down to the last officer. I think when we talk about transformation, especially as leaders, we talk about it in terms of structure and abstract concepts and strategies that at the end of the day may leave people wondering, but all that's great, I completely agree with it, but what does it mean for me? And I think we've paid particular attention to this question of what does it mean for me and what can I do in our context. But before getting into this ground-up look at how is it that people can actively participate in transformation, I just wanted to also start off by saying that our strategies or our approach are a mix of both what we would call top-down as well as bottom-up. And I think to us the trick is really finding the right balance between the two. And in this age of complexity, which is rapidly changing, I think there's a recognition that we can't leave transformation entirely to ground-up efforts. I mean, as we heard from McKinsey earlier, leadership is very crucial to transformation. And I think for coherence in the system as to where we're going, we do need that alignment. And we do need that alignment that comes from collective leadership. So, I mean, if you want to have a garden, I mean, it can't just be letting 1,000 flowers bloom. I mean, if you want a rainforest, that's a different matter. But if you want a garden, you can let 1,000 flowers bloom, but you need some kind of idea and leadership as to the design of the garden. And that's where we think this element of top-down leadership, collective leadership is important. And for us, in our current phase of transformation, public sector transformation in Singapore, we see a concrete manifestation of that collective leadership in spelling out, articulating what the outcomes are, the North Star, if you will, of where we're heading to and what we're transforming to as a service. The question of what will we look like if we get there? And this takes the form of being a lean, agile, and digital government. It takes the form of having skilled and adaptable leaders, as well as officers, and as well as being leading in innovation. But having said that, in terms of like the collective leadership buy-in as to where we're headed for transformation, having said that this was a collective leadership exercise, it wasn't even then solely one that was entirely top-down without any regard whatsoever for where the body of public officers and what they wanted. I mean, this was signed off collectively by the leadership because at the end of the day, it is very much a responsibility of the leadership to bring that into fruition. But it's also done through a process of ground-up engagement, and we've heard a lot about how transformation is very successful if you're journeying with the people, if you hear from the people, and you engage with the people who are doing the actual work, as opposed to leaders who sit in the room and drop nice papers and strategies. But yeah, it was also crafted with inputs and with extensive dialogues and engagement with ground staff as to where we wanted to go. So those are some thoughts as to getting the balance right between what is top-down and what would be bottom-up and what would be like actively opportunities for people to participate directly in the transformation. I think on the point of bottom-up participation, I would say that for Singapore is not new. I mean, since the 1990s, we've had the Public Service for the 21st Century movement, which is a movement of continuous improvement as to how we work individually and as a public service. And every officer is not only empowered to, but also compelled to make changes in the way that he or she works. We had staff suggestion schemes where everybody had the opportunity and were in fact required to put forth suggestions as to how to make their work environment or their work processes better and more efficient. We had work improvement teams, which legitimize people working across agencies to make things better. I mean, all these sound like challenges that we're grappling with, and how do we bring these about right now? But these were things that we were trying to do even in the mid-90s. So that was fit for its time. And transformation today, in terms of how the outcomes that I outlined earlier, about being lean, agile, and digital, about being skilled and adaptable, and about being leading in innovation. These were crafted in a way to speak to the individual, speak to the officer. Let's take digital, for example. Organizationally, like we heard from Serbia, Singapore, no less, and many of your countries as well, we want to be a digital government. We want to be a smart nation. We want to deliver services in a high-tech and a high-touch way. And then this means, what does it mean to the individual officer then? It means you have to acquire the skills. You know, you could say, oh, my organization wants to do this, but what about me? What am I supposed to do about that? And so we translate being digital into the skills that you have to acquire in order to be able to deliver these services in a high-tech and high-touch way. And that's also linked to the other outcome that I was talking about in terms of being a skilled and adaptable officers. And that's, again, something that's directly relevant and actionable by the individual officer. And we've organized our efforts around this in terms of a digital skills framework for the entire public service with really basic digital literacy at the bottom tier and all the way up to what kind of digital skills that the leaders need in order to drive these kinds of transformation. And I think the spirit of continuous improvement that we had in our earlier movement, the one that I talked about from the mid-90s, the movement about public service for the 21st century, that spirit of continuous improvement that was embodied back then, in this day and age, takes the manifestation of innovation. And I think what we've done is that we've experimented with different platforms, with at different levels, different ways of enabling innovation. And the idea is to be able to shape behavior through these participation in these platforms, and from that build a culture of innovation. And let me give you a couple of examples. We had the Public Service Innovation Challenge, which was an open call across all 84 of our agencies, all 145,000 of our public officers to say, hey, what are your ideas to make the public service a better place? And we had, through 2 open calls, we had more than 300 officers submitting more than 100 ideas. We had 35 projects funded up to our limits of like 70,000. And this was really a way to allow ground-up innovation to bubble up. And we saw our role at the center as creating these platforms for these kinds of innovations to bubble up. We also had a couple of whole-of-government makeathons. And makeathons for us are inspired by hackathons. So it's with a cross-cutting problem statement, like how might we make the public service a better and more vibrant place that we're proud to work in. And it's a makeathon because it's not just digital solutions. It's also, the possibilities and the ambit of solutions much broader than digital. And then we had, for example, one of the makeathons around our Smart Nation vision and how to create stronger communities and better living for everyone. And from that, we had people come in, take part in a fairly intense program of about 2 to 3 days over a period of a couple of months, where you actually go down to the ground and you talk to residents and you develop prototypes and you iterate them and you test your solutions. And so we had senior management level people come in, go out to one of our neighborhood heartlands and talk to seniors there, find out what they want, what their lives were like. The teams developed solutions which included prototypes, which included like an app which allowed for location-based job matching to cater for different arrangements or the need for different work arrangements. There was also a prototype around designing a wearable that was based on dialect. I mean, in Singapore, we've got different languages with the different racial groups, and then the vernacular in dialects is the language that the elderly use. And it was a wearable that was designed to speak to them in their dialect in terms of their health status, government services, supermarket rebates or offers even. We've got senior citizen days where you get like a 1% rebate if you go to the supermarket on a Tuesday. So these were some ideas. These are some platforms and opportunities where people could come in and participate. I think in ending, I just wanted to say that we really do view transformation as a multi-level, multi-pronged effort that really needs to reach the hearts and minds and hands of every one of our public officers. And my personal take on that is that actually it's the hearts and minds that's crucial. I mean, the Prime Minister of Serbia, Prime Minister Ana, said earlier today that it's the biggest challenge is about changing mindsets. And I think if we get to the hearts and minds of people, if we get people's hearts and minds, then the hands kind of take care of themselves, because you can't come up with all the ideas for people to use to put into action anyway. Some of this needs to come up from the people. So that's broadly my take on what is it we do to enable innovation.
Yeah, thanks, Charlene. And I think one of the really interesting common threads from all 3 of our speakers so far has been that idea of actually viewing improving government from the perspective of public servants themselves. So we talk a lot about being sort of customer or citizen or client centered, but actually if you're thinking about improvement, it can be very helpful to adopt the perspective of the people that you're trying to work with. Rupert.
Great. Thanks, Martin. So let me go to a third dimension of looking at this, which is the, having agreed with everything that has been said and resonating very strongly with what's happening in the UK civil service, but going up to a sort of a meta level. Two sort of quick anecdotes. So I had a ride down to Salisbury Plain with my military counterpart, Richard Nugent, who's the Director of Defence People, and we were talking about the very similar challenges we face. And we were talking about the new aircraft carrier, the new QE2. And he made an observation that I thought was very telling, which was the last commander, the last captain of that aircraft carrier has not yet been born. And it's interesting because so much of what we do in public service compared to private sector, and I'm a relatively new public servant of only about 3 years duration, is that what we're dealing with is really very big and very long range and very long term. So when I think about this question and what does a people-centered approach to transforming public service means, I always want to come back to that. So I'm thinking about, we have the largest graduate recruitment scheme in the country. We take in 1,500 graduates. We have over 50,000 applications for that program. But really that program is about making sure that we've got leaders after all those people have been whittled away and been attracted to work for McKinsey or IBM, that we've got a core who can be the top and best leaders for the United Kingdom in the 2040s and 2050s, taking some very big decisions at that time. And that's how we look at that long-range program. And I think one helpful way to think about this too is about capabilities. And I think that becomes even more important, given the last panel we've heard, when we're thinking about capabilities being a hybrid of other parts of the economy, the role of new cognitive systems, and of course the people who work in those systems. And without going down that rabbit hole, let me say that I think that one of the really exciting things about working in public service is that compared to some other sectors, there's going to be a lot of skill augmentation in the public service. And people's jobs are going to become more interesting, I think. And to use a quote which we're using ourselves as we test what we do on automation, lots of opportunities actually in the quite short term to take the robot out of the human and give people more space to do interesting work in the public sector. But on capability, we're going through a fascinating experiment in capability at the moment with the largest peacetime challenge that the UK civil service has had to face with EU exit. And one of my responsibilities is thinking about capability in that context. And I would say we are keeping up. And through this, we have created new capabilities. One of the most fascinating things for me as I watch the system as a whole is the way that we have new emergent capabilities that were never there before. Looking at whole professions and sectors as a whole rather than a departmental level, building up skills in different disciplines, whether it's international negotiation or parliamentary skills, which weren't there before. And this building of capability is really, really important. So, if you forgive me using one other military analogy, so but this is one I keep returning to because I think it describes for me part of what this is about in terms of people-centered transformation. And it's one that happened at the turn of the 20th century. So at the turn of the 20th century, the United Kingdom fought a war with the Boer republics, and in that there were many casualties in the British Army from sniper fire, from very effective rifle fire. And then roll forward, 14 years later, the British Expeditionary Forces in Belgium encounters the first wave of the German advance, and the Germans come under fire, which is so rapid rifle fire, they think they're under machine gun fire. And what happened in that 14-year period was a piece of capability building within the UK military that was quite rapid and very effective. And to me, that's a bit of a metaphor for what's happening in government at the moment as we look at different forms of capability building. So just to give a final example of that, I'd encourage anyone who isn't doing this already to look at our excellent National Audit Office reports. They come out, they're very objective. They're always a bit painful to read if you're the subject of one of them, but speaking of experience. And look at what's been said about the Carillion collapse, because that's a really interesting example of this capability building in action. So about 5 years ago, a decision was taken to build, it was one of Jeremy Hayward's Cabinet Secretary's priorities, ministerial priority, to build digital capability and commercial capability, and across government, pervasively. And there was a radical change in the way we approach contracting with the private sector. And as a result of that, as you'll see, without going into detail, you can read it yourselves, it's in the public domain, that meant that what happened with Carillion and that collapse was very contained, and actually the citizen and government, the taxpayer, did not actually have some of the damage that they might have had, virtually none, compared to what might have happened before. So that's about emergent capability. The final thing I just want to say before finishing is, as well as capability building, and also thinking about emergent capabilities across the whole government system, I think it's very interesting to think about how do you actually affect change through individuals in government. Just as a brief example of that, there are several things which have happened in the UK government in the past 5 years which have been extraordinarily effective, because they seem to have ignited some kind of inner fire within every level of the workforce, whether it's in the middle management, the front line, or the most senior leaders and permanent secretaries. One of them is diversity and inclusion, and an absolute commitment to see that as a way of making sure we have the best people doing jobs in government, and that, above all, that we are representative of the UK population as a whole. And that takes us down to some really fascinating debates about representation outside London, ethnicity, gender, every characteristic. And it's very deep within the DNA of the civil service, not just at the leadership level, but at all levels. The next is actually leadership itself. The civil service has had for about 5 years a leadership statement. It's very simple. It's very surprisingly uncontested in what it requires, which is making sure that people are inspiring of their teams, confident and empowering of their teams. But what we're now seeing is some quite interesting work on how do we actually define, what does that mean in the many different contexts we've got within government. And one of the features there, again, I'd sort of commend you to have a look at it in the budget, and last week, the new Centre for Public Service Leadership in the UK, which is now being set up, it's about to be set up. Very interesting research about the distinctiveness of public sector leadership challenges versus private sector leadership challenges, and how do we actually recognise that across the public service. And the final thing is, linked back to my point about Carillion and the commercial capability, we have started to build an architecture within the UK government which is very focused on professionalisation. Now, that is a two-edged sword, because professionalisation needs to be contextualised, because being an IT person in the Ministry of Defence is different from being an IT person in the Department for Education. But how do you find the right elements of commonality and set a standard so that everybody within the civil service, no matter what they're doing, is actually consider themselves deeply rooted with a career anchor in some profession. And that's having a very interesting effect, because it is moving away from the idea that a UK civil servant is a generalist, that the most senior people are generalists. Everybody sitting around the table of the permanent secretaries should have a profession that they feel they own and they are associated with. So we're actually debating now, we've got a very powerful brand in the market around the generalist fast stream. What is that really? It's really about policy and operations, and building people who can be leaders, who can manage across that spectrum. So it's a really exciting time, I think, globally for the public service, and public service actually has a lot to offer the wider economy, I think, in how to do transformation.
Wonderful, Rupert, thank you. And you started talking a little bit about some of the efforts that have been put in place to try and actually implement some of these ideals. And I think that's something I'd like us to talk about a little bit more, because I think there's a lot of agreement, actually, it sounds like, on the sort of normatively where do we want to be going with the public service. But the process of actually trying to implement reforms, whether in government, whether about personnel or other matters, is not fantastic, to say the least. So I was wondering, maybe for our other three panelists, and we can come back to you as well, because I'm sure you'll have more stories also. Could you talk a little bit about maybe one initiative that you've witnessed or been involved with, which has been trying to address some of these issues but hasn't been successful, and what it was in the kind of design and implementation of that which led to that eventual failure or lack of complete success, if we want to be a bit more optimistic?
Sure. So I live in Baltimore. I came from Baltimore. I worked in Baltimore before I went to work for the state of Maryland. How many of you have seen The Wire? Seen The Wire? Okay, Baltimore is very different than what it's perceived in The Wire, but there's an element of it called CompStat, which the police use, and it's really very sensationalized, but it wasn't that far from the truth, where the police basically had these built-in incentives to have arrest rates lower and have, at the same time, homicide rates lower. And so in the show, they're seen like hiding bodies in abandoned buildings and doing these things. It's not so far from the truth as to what it sort of manifested in sort of the stat. If you followed it all, the stop and frisk work that was happening in New York City, a lot of that was generated out of CompStat, which were these high demands that produced incredible results. Like if you have experienced Times Square in the 70s and you experience Times Square now, there is a demonstrable difference, right? It is basically the difference of going to Disneyland and going to like a red light district. So, which have, I guess benefits for both, but very different experiences. So when you're there, you feel it. But these were because we created these demands on a public sector workforce that was stretched, that was under-resourced, that didn't have necessarily the skills to understand why they needed the data to change. They just knew that they didn't want to go back into that room in front of those accountability panels and really understand how could they do that. So they were what I call maliciously obedient to kind of the directive in the room, which was lower those rates. And it was by any means. And so we see gaming happen, right? It produced this really perverse response to the accountability, which was because the actual measures were not built out with frontline officers, with community members, with the realities of the pressures of the job, that they were just these hard and fast goals and objectives that were driven by a demand that leadership wanted to see lower violence rates. They wanted to see more, they wanted to see less arrests, but higher impact or more arrests in some cases. And so you saw these officers essentially respond instead of to the needs of the community and to the actual skills that they had as crime solvers and interventionists to the data and the need for the data to change. And so one of the things that I think we've learned is, and even now, the guy who started CompStat, Bratton, who was the sort of godfather of the whole stat movement, just published a book called, Collaborate or Perish. We have to start thinking about creating these frameworks and these accountability measures in a way that's actually reflective of what the capacity of the work is. And so I think as a caution is that we think about what are those incentives, how we align them, and how they actually match to outcomes is critically important.
Thanks, Beth. That's a wonderful example. Dustin.
Sure. So it kind of follows along one of the examples I was giving before, but about 8 years ago I was engaged in an effort to reform the federal hiring process. And at that point, one of the biggest pieces of feedback we were hearing is just how difficult it is to apply. You used to have to write, I'm seeing one person who has applied for a federal job. I would love to say it's so much better now, but we used to require people to do essays, right? Knowledge, skills, abilities. You have to write all these essays to apply. We said that's crazy. You should not have to fill out essays to be able to initially apply. So we largely was eliminated in favor of resume-based hiring. What that did was flood our system with applicants. I mean, we saw 10, 20, 100 times more applicants, which was great, right? On the one hand, we saw all these kind of new people potentially applying. We did not get the legislative fixes that we had asked for to help managers do a better job of assessing those for talent and quality. And we definitely did not have our HR workforce and systems to technology capable of going through those in a way that was effective or efficient. And so we created a lot of expectations, I think, for people around, bringing in all this new talent, reducing the amount of time it takes to hire somebody. We also got into a bit of an issue, building on Beth's point, around we should be doing this within 80 days, and that started to take on a life of its own for people being held accountable for making a hire within 80 days, which then led to people prioritizing the time, right, rather than quality. And so there was just a lot of pressure. No, it doesn't matter who you get, just get somebody within 80 days, because I'm being measured on whether or not this is being done within 80 days. So it really kind of set up this perfect storm where we really hadn't, I think, worked through properly the full end-to-end life cycle that goes from recruitment all the way through hiring, and kind of just open the spigot, in one end, and without really kind of dealing with the downstream consequences, which in fairness we did kind of anticipate, but didn't actually work as hard with Congress to get the legislative authorities, because believe it or not, there are like legislative prohibitions on being able to assign a score to an applicant, which is like crazy, but it's actually not allowed. So we do need like even some legislative relief in areas that you would never assume, but actually are pretty important to really make the system kind of work effectively. So I am, right now, I should just briefly note, and actually this is something Nairi deserves credit for helping nudge me. I'm taking a sabbatical right now from OMB through the beginning of February, where I'm working with the Volcker Alliance on an effort to get government and universities partnering. And so we're going around to several different cities across the country. Half through them are government people, half through them university people. And what we've heard is about 5-6 years ago, federal government just stopped coming to campus for a number of reasons, and haven't really come back since. And so I think that's another kind of lesson learned, that really making sure you're building up those relationships, because it's not kind of in the DNA of many of our organizational culture to spend time on recruitment and out recruiting. So we're really trying to reform some of those relationships that I think have not been maintained over time. And so far we've done 2 of these sessions, one at Carnegie Mellon, one over at University of North Carolina, and the feedback has been overwhelmingly positive, and that yes, these are conversations that definitely need to happen, and people are very committed to it. So I think that's also a sign of optimism, and the students we've had in these sessions are as committed to public service as I think we've ever seen, and so the level of interest is definitely still very, very, very strong.
Thanks, Dustin. Charlene?
Okay. I think instead of answering that straight on in terms of what hasn't worked, I think I'll take the liberty to sort of approach this in the frame of a challenge, of challenges that we're facing. And I think one of the key challenges, one of the key people-centered challenges that transformation has thrown up for us is that challenge of workforce disruptions. The challenge of moving people, of people who are in jobs where maybe we take the robot out of them, and there's greater efficiency arising from automation, from technology. And so at a macro level, you kind of just need less people for that job. But at the same time, there are other areas in public service, in the public sector, that are growing needs, that need a lot of good people. But it's much easier on paper to do that kind of shifting around of people, because of robotic process automation in this area. You actually need the number of people processing these things to go down from X to X minus 20. You've got 20 extra headcount. I can move that into some other place. But when it gets down to the individual human being, it's a very different story, moving the headcounts around from moving the individual human being around. And so these are challenges that we face right now, coming out of being in transformation, where we can redesign jobs, or we can transform the way we operate, and we can transform our work processes. But there's an impact on the people who are doing the work. And how do we address this? I think one of the things that we found to be effective would be to craft an opportunity narrative to speak to the mission-mindedness or the spirit of mission of officers. So it's not so much that, you know, you don't have a job anymore because the software has taken over your jobs. Can you move to this other place? The narrative of opportunity needs to be one that asks, how can you serve your citizens better? Where are the needs of your citizens better served? And if I free you up from doing these things because of RPA or because of some other technology, how can we then best put you in a place where you can fulfill your mission of wanting to serve the people better? So, I mean, that's the challenge is one that's ongoing. I don't think we're going to see the end of it anytime soon, just as we're not going to see the end of digital transformation of government anytime soon, but it's something that's very real in terms of what needs to also be done in order to bring about full transformation.
Great, thank you. Rupert, any failures or challenges that you'd like to speak about?
So I think and I'd like to come back on Charlene's point, because I completely agree with that challenge, which is what we face and how it can be dealt with. I think I'd highlight two different things. One is where things have been taken because they were the fashion or the trend in the wider economy globally in leading organizations, and applied into government and the amount of damage that can do. So one of the things which I would say civil servants have sort of iconically resented is the forced distribution of performance management. And there is I think that the introduction of that created back to the point about, you know, whether it's malicious or ignorant obedience, and it's a great phrase, is, you know, it was one of a number of things which I think led to the atrophy of line management capability in thinking about people. You know, whereas a key point about a performance management system, which, you know, the best firms know, is it's about the conversation between the manager and the individual and getting that person to be their best and focusing on strengths and managing out the people who aren't going to be successful in that role. It focuses on a very rigid bureaucratic process. So I'm very pleased that we've removed that, and we're now moving and actually releasing a lot of innovative potential in departments about how they do performance management. We're doing another similar thing in respect of the way in which we do selection. We had rolled out over the past decade, a very rigid way of doing selection, competency-based recruitment. Not bad in itself, but necessarily narrow in what it actually measured. And we're now going for something which is much more empowering of the line manager, much more trusting of the line manager, to allow them to look at a broader range of things, very similar to the US experience in that, perhaps. And that then comes on to another thing, which, if I sort of look ahead and think about what am I frightened of making an error on, it's underinvesting in the deployment and embedding of some of these changes. And not just underinvesting, but also not managing the expectation of employees or of senior leaders, or frankly of politicians, about how long some of these changes will take, because these are big systematic changes across, you know, large workforces operating in very different contexts. I think this thing about how do you help people, and maybe this is the thing that we have as public servants, it's a very useful thing, that we do have this fundamental core that we're about serving the nation, the public. I've seen this very much in talking to prison officers and seeing the way in which in the UK are civil servants, and the way in which they have had their jobs liberated to do their main job, which is rehabilitating prisoners, by being relieved through automation of basic admin activity, which can be very manual and unvalue adding. And then a very eminent firefighter in the UK, Steve McGurk, who's now retired. He was the chief firefighter in Cheshire. He now chairs an NHS trust. He was also on the Centre for Public Service Leadership Task Force. He had a great example. He's a great example because in Cheshire, they worked out that actually, you know, what's the main job of the fire service? Really to prevent fire. So you have to re-educate firefighters to see that part of that is fitting smoke detectors. And that is actually something that they did, and sure enough, it's had a big impact on fire deaths in there and in other areas. So I think that's a really interesting challenge for us over the next 20 years, probably, to do what, Charlene, you described.
Great, thank you for that. I'd like to throw the floor open for questions now. Please make them questions rather than comments, and one question each, unless you have a question for Charlene, in which case you're allowed to ask two, since she had a two-part question this morning. So we have one at the back, and then one here, one at the back, and one more in the middle.
Okay. Hello, my name's Catherine Nwajako. I'm from the OECD. I had a question about the title of, related to the title of this session, which is about people-centered. And I was struck by Rupert's comment in terms when you were talking about recruitment, that you referred to diversity and inclusion. You didn't labour it too much, but you said it was important. And throughout all of the talks, I kind of got a sense from that we were talking about public servants needing to be people responsive, but the people being out there and the servants being in here. So I wondered, in terms of your recruitment practices or your thinking on inclusion and diversity, how you create a public service that actually reflects who the people are, so that we move beyond this public servants for them, rather than a public service which is of them. Thanks.
That's a wonderful question. Thank you. We had two in the middle here.
My name is Karim, and I'm a lawyer from Egypt. In many developing countries like Egypt, we suffer from the lack of talents in the public sector organization. So my question to the panel is, how do you think we can attract talents from the private sector to the public sector, rather than relying on personal initiative from someone who made it in the private sector as his career and wants to do a move now? Thank you.
Hi, I'm Becky. I'm a reporter for Civil Service World magazine. My question's for Rupert McNeil, but could be for everyone as well. You talked about the move towards professionalism and the professions in the civil service and the recruitment overhaul with the success profiles. Could there ever be a scenario where you would do away with the need for a generalist fast stream altogether? Could you see the end of the generalist in the civil service? Would that be a good thing, or would there always be a place for generalists in the civil service?
Thank you. And one more at the back.
So thanks for this panel. I wanted to just make a comparison to this morning. This morning I left with a strong impression from a very impressive panel that the dominant simile needs to be citizen as consumer. And from this afternoon, the panel that briefly preceded you, I left with simile that government as lumbering monopoly that can't make agile plans. You guys need a hummable tune for your story, and it needs the form of a simile. As Charlene and Rupert have both told very inspiring stories, what is the simile that we can take away for the importance of motivated, public-minded civil servants?
Great. So I think you can feel free to answer any of those questions that you want. But yeah, bonus points if you come up with an excellent simile and coin the phrase behind the next 10 years of civil service reforms.
Well, just more broadly around the question around kind of recruitment, I find it rather interesting right now that, at least in the U.S., we see increasingly corporate kind of America try to lay claim to some sort of social kind of impact that they're having. And that is something that obviously we in government have in spades. The difference is we do a really bad job talking about it. We, I think, have a huge opportunity to be better at storytelling about kind of the impact that we have each and every day. And ultimately, I think that's the strongest bet we have. And it's hard to talk about the federal government kind of in one broad stroke. There are certain agencies that do an amazing job of this and have really strong brands and amazing pipelines and kind of engagement with the private sector, with universities, and do this very well. There are other agencies whose mission is just as incredible and having just as much impact, but don't have that kind of built into their culture. So I think there are things that we can learn. And in the U.S. case, our civilian agencies can learn a lot from the way our military kind of goes out and sells its mission and really has an extraordinary kind of network of people that are out recruiting each and every day and doing that in an effective way. So I think that's a big one. On the generalist question, that's actually something that we're dealing with quite a bit in the U.S. as well. We used to be, 100% in our general schedule system. We're down to only having 2/3 of our workforce in the general schedule, and almost every year, new categories and occupations are kind of being carved out because the general schedule is not kind of meeting their needs. Most recently, the cybersecurity profession, at least for DHS, and maybe some point that will become government-wide, is being kind of taken out of the general schedule, and they're developing an entire new kind of occupational series with a completely new pay structure, completely new training development structure that one of our top civil servants is leading at DHS. So I think there is a real compelling kind of question of whether we should be shifting to focus more on occupation-specific strategies. And for us, that really then raises the question, who should be leading those endeavors? Is it our kind of central Office of Personnel Management, which doesn't have kind of subject matter expertise in any of those areas, or should we be trying to leverage some of our agencies who do have subject matter kind of expertise relative to these occupational series and putting them in a position to take on a greater leadership role for really imagining what the future kind of needs for this workforce is going to be? We do that with nurses, for instance. Our Veterans Affairs agency does all of the nurse kind of pay, classification, training, development for the entire federal government, right? So there is some precedent for that, and I think it's a model that's definitely worth exploring as you look to the future to have much more kind of occupation-specific things. The federal government looks very different than how it was originally kind of crafted in terms of pay and classification when most of the workforce was kind of lower graded administrative workforce. Today it's completely flipped. We have twice the rate of lawyers, doctors, engineers, scientists that the private sector has, and have really shifted much more to master's degrees, pretty highly educated workforce. And so we need to think about what that means for our personnel structures going forward. And I think that's going to lead to a lot more kind of delegation to either agencies or occupations versus kind of the ability to try to have a one-size-fits-all solution.
Any similes?
Let me come back to me on that.
Yeah. Charlene?
Okay, I don't think I'm going to try for the bonus points either, whether it's answering all the questions or the similes. But I thought what Catherine talked about in terms of creating a public service that really reflects the people that we serve, I thought that was a very important point, a very key one. I think she mentioned recruitment. I feel that it needs to go beyond recruitment, and it goes really into the ethos of what it means to serve and the ethos of what it means to be a public officer. I think with the significant emphasis on user centricity, on user design, in terms of what we do, whether it's policies or the design or the execution or service delivery, that gives me a lot of hope in terms of how the public service can really internalize, what is it that they do for the people and how they serve the people, and bring us closer to that the world where there isn't that divide between we, the public servants, and you, the citizens, and the customer. Because really, at the end of the day, all public officers are citizens as well, and they're consumers of the services that government puts out there. I mean, how do we bring that into one? I think the emphasis on citizen centricity, whether it's individuals or it's businesses, and I use the term citizen very loosely, as a whole separate debate on what constitutes citizens. I think that's a very key thrust in terms of how we can level up on that basis. And I think looking at that from a leadership perspective, then I think it is the leadership's responsibility to create the structures and the platforms that allow for these kinds of sensibilities to flourish, whether it's through capability building or how the actual work processes, what you actually go through before you deliver a new service, before you execute a different or change a policy. And I mean, this is something that the private sector is very strong at, and I think that adds to the urgency and the need for the public service to do this. I mean, in Singapore, one of our major banks, on a learning journey with them, we heard how this need to take an ethnographic or ethnocentric approach to their product design and their product delivery really infuses the entire organization. And as part of senior management, before you approve a new credit card, that actually, hey, looks really good on paper, on plan, you know, the benefits, who gets to apply, what your target group is, you better go out there and talk to these people that you're designing the credit card for, and talk to them and find out, you know what, does this actually work for you? Is this something that you would get? Does this meet your needs? And so I think the leadership responsibility is to create an environment where all this is infused really throughout what the organization does and how the organization goes about these things. And I think about talent in the public service and how we can attract more talent to the public service, I think I go back again to what I was talking about in terms of mission. I think at the end of the day, it's about people with a strong, deep passion to want to serve people, whether it's your society, your country, the citizens. And I think that in addition to passion, because, well, I mean, you can argue whether man lives by passion alone, but I think career development is also very key, to know that you are embarking on a career where there are opportunities for you to progress in terms of your own personal development, in terms of the career and where you're going. Daniel Pink, in his book Drive, wrote about motivations, and it's about purpose, autonomy, and mastery. You know, that applies, I think, very much as well as to approaches on career development. What kind of, I mean, purpose we talked about in terms of that passion and the mission to serve. But what about autonomy? What about mastery? Mastery in particular, the capability building. Yeah, so that's a couple of thoughts. I'm drawing a blank right now on the similes. I think it might be the jet lag. Yeah, but I think the importance of public-mindedness, I think, I don't know, this might be a rather lame attempt at it, but I think it's as crucial as DNA is to people. I mean, it's not something that, you know, it's not like a hat that you put on for today and you really like it. It needs to be something as integral and as part of you as your DNA should be. And so I think that's how important the public-mindedness needs to be for the public service and public officers.
Thank you, Rupert. I'm going to try
and you've promised us a simile.
I've got a simile. So on representation, I think that's a description exactly of the essence of the issue, which is that at every level within the civil service, from the most senior to the most junior, it needs to be reflective of the citizenry. And that's something which is pervading everything we're doing. And the great thing is that if you aim for that, then every people process that you run will be optimized for everybody. So it's a great thing. Very happy to talk more about this. I'm really interested in the Egyptian context. I'm very jealous, actually, because, wow, what a country with so many young people. I said I'd do a trade, maybe. But I think the key thing here is to get people, really back to what Charlene said. I think the civil service offers public service offers a huge advantage, I would say, in the UK to private organisations as a place where people can develop much faster than they could in a private sector context, because they have more responsibility generally, they have more constraints, and they're more visible, and so I think it can be sold on that basis. Once you've got them in, and the trick is to get the right people in, the work is so interesting. I mean, I wish I'd joined 20 years ago. The work is so interesting that actually it's very sticky. And we find people they go out, and then they come back in, and that's what we want to encourage. So I'd be very optimistic about that. Generalist civil service. Generalist is a very powerful brand in the marketplace. We think of it, as I said, as policy and operational delivery. Some of you may have heard my colleague Tony Meggs, who heads up the IPA, talk about the valley of death. If you Google it, you'll find that, between policy and delivery. And really, that's what we want people to be able to bridge as generalists. I wouldn't think that the generalist concept will disappear. We've made some comments on this and some evidence to the PACAC, House of Commons Public Administration Committee, which you might want to have a look at, where we talk in more detail about that. So, what a great question, the simile. So I think The simile here is beehives. Because I think that what I've noticed is that civil servants, each bee in the beehive is very capable of doing its job. But they also have an emergent collective ability to respond to threat, to gather things, and to do their work of making honey and creating more bees. And the reason I think that's a very powerful image for us to have for public service generally, if you think about the public sector in a country as 8 beehives, we need to sort of protect them as well. I think one of the interesting things that we probably learned over the past 20 years is that we thought that bees were something we took for granted, but actually it's quite a fragile ecosystem. And they need to be protected, and they're very effective. So I would go, it's a bit Napoleonic maybe, because that was his symbol, but maybe that's not bad. So, but bees, yeah, the beehive.
Thank you. Beth.
I'm going to start with my simile, I think. I was thinking about my simile as being kind of like a garage punk band that signs to a major label and makes it, you know? So it's like you've got a voice, you've got a strong opinion, you've got core values, you're drawn to something, you're mission-driven, and then it resonates, and you can connect to people, and then you realize that like you have an appeal at a massive level. And I think that, as someone who was born on the front lines of government, and when I left government, I was the chief operating officer of a state, oversaw 85% of the entire state's budget and the comparable amount of its workforce. And I was a punk rock drummer at the same time also. So it really did feel very, but the thing about it wasn't because I had an Ivy League education that I was valued. It wasn't because I was trained in the hallowed halls. It was because I consistently and routinely brought the frontline perspective to some of the hardest conversations that government had. And so when you're thinking about a career, and I'm going to take advantage of being around some students who are going to eventually start thinking about this, I can't tell you how important and valuable my frontline experience was. And I was a lawyer. I was well educated when I went and entered the front lines of government, and it has continued to be the experience that has nourished and pushed and really grew my career. And it's the most, and it's the experience I call on the most. So my simile is definitely that sort of disruption, that loud, that fast-paced, that you can sort of bring forward and make mainstream. I don't want to forget about this question of inclusivity and to be thinking about community, because it's not just about making sure that you have targets and goals and that you're thinking about it, but it has to be a deliberate action that you take in every way that you think about every single decision that you make in government. And so when we think about closing gaps and being less biased and being more inclusive, it means that we have to change the way that people access it. The regular town hall meeting doesn't work. If you're trying to actually recruit people, you just can't put up information on a website. You have to go into the spaces and the places where the people you most want to attract into your governments are operating, are thinking, are strategizing, and they're not on your government employee portal. You have to go into communities that matter, that are underrepresented, and you have to handhold the connection from those communities into your processes. And if you're not doing that, then you will get a business as usual approach. So.
And I think this is an issue that the UK higher education sector could learn something from government on, actually.
Just one real quick thing. Actually, Charlene said something earlier that made me think of a saying we have in our office, which is, yes, we want 1,000 flowers to bloom, but all in straight rows. and one of the things that we did that really tried to maybe give you an example of how we led an effort is around, we do a people survey. I think many of our governments do. For years it was discounted by leadership, as that's just where the people who are griping about the job go and say bad things. We really worked hard to get them to understand, no, this stuff matters for your mission. There is a relationship. The evidence is strong between employee engagement levels and your productivity and your performance. So we created an engagement index of 15 questions, and we went from about 300 or 400 organizational breakouts to 28,000 organizational breakouts. When I go out across the country now and I ask how many of you have seen your office's employee survey results, 70, 80, 90% of the hands go up, whereas just a few years ago, no one had ever seen this data. By getting the data in the hands of frontline folks and middle managers, it started forcing some conversations that were long overdue in government. And we have been able to increase our engagement levels by 6 points in 4 years. That's a 15-question index across every single question and across almost every single agency, including through the transition, I might add, to the first 2 years of this administration. So I think it's a powerful story of just the role that we can play, I think, often, especially in the center, of liberating kind of some of this information, getting it into the hands of people who are extremely committed to the mission. In the U.S., 96% of our workforce are willing to put in additional effort to get the job done, and that's like the biggest strength that we've got.
Great. Thank you all very much. If you out in the audience have brilliant ideas for the simile, which we very clearly need, in addition to our beehive and garage punk similes, if we get some more, we can start mixing them and get some really weird metaphors going on. Do talk about that during coffee. We also have this hashtag here for the for Twitter or other social media kind of things that people cooler than me know about. So tweet out your similes. But all that remains is to join me in thanking our wonderful panelists. Thank you.
Thank you all, ladies and gentlemen. So now it's your time for afternoon coffee or tea. You, of course, have an hour to enjoy that in the Inamori Forum. After that, we're again going into 2 parallel sessions. So we talked quite a lot about values. For those of you who want to revisit those and think about the importance of integrity in government, please come back in here, where a group building out of research that goes on here in the school on building integrity will be looking at that issue in the context of institutional integrity.